The morning sun had barely touched the red mesa when 8-year-old Tommy Carter noticed the girl hiding behind the old oak tree near his family's water well. She couldn't have been more than his age, but her ribs showed through torn clothing, and her dark eyes held the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten in days. What Tommy did next would change not just his life, but the entire history of Pine Ridge Valley, Arizona territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tommy had been carrying his lunch pail to the fields where his father James worked, breaking ground for their expanded corn crop. The Carter family had settled in Pine Ridge Valley 3 years earlier, drawn by promises of fertile land and the chance to build something lasting in the Arizona territory. What the land agents hadn't mentioned were the tensions simmering between the growing number of homesteaders and the Apache bands who had called this valley home for generations. The sight of the girl stopped Tommy in his tracks. She was clearly Apache, recognizable by her traditional clothing and the way she moved silently through the brush. Most children in Pine Ridge had been taught to fear the Apache, to run at the first sight of their distinctive dress and features. The adults spoke in hushed tones about raids and conflicts, about the need for vigilance and the importance of staying close to the settlement. But Tommy saw something different in this girl's face. Beyond the wariness and the obvious hunger, he recognized something familiar. It was the same expression his younger sister Emma had worn during their first harsh winter when their food stores ran dangerously low, when their mother Elizabeth had quietly divided her own portions to ensure the children ate enough. The girl noticed Tommy watching her and froze like a deer caught in an open meadow. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the dusty ground between the oak tree and the well. Tommy could see her calculating whether to run or stand her ground, her small hands clenched at her sides in preparation for flight, instead of calling out or running back to the house as he'd been taught. Tommy slowly reached into his lunch pail and withdrew the thick slice of bread his mother had prepared that morning. It was good bread, baked fresh with precious wheat flour that had to be hauled in by wagon from Tucson. His family couldn't afford to waste such luxuries, but something in the girl's desperate gaze compelled him to act. Tommy took a careful step forward, then another, moving slowly so as not to startle her. He extended the bread toward her, using simple gestures to indicate his peaceful intentions. The girl's eyes widened with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. She glanced around nervously, clearly aware that being discovered near the settler's homestead could bring serious consequences for both of them. The interaction lasted only minutes, but Tommy would remember every detail for the rest of his life. The girl eventually crept forward, snatched the bread from his outstretched hand, and disappeared into the brush so quickly he almost wondered if he'd imagined the entire encounter. But the grateful look in her dark eyes had been real enough, and Tommy felt a strange warmth in his chest as he continued toward the fields. That evening, Tommy said nothing to his family about the encounter. Something told him that his parents, despite their generally kind nature, might not understand his impulse to feed an Apache child. The tensions in Pine Ridge Valley had been escalating in recent months, with reports of missing livestock and occasional confrontations between settlers and Apache hunting parties. James Carter was a fair man who tried to treat all people with respect, but he also had a family to protect in territory where misunderstandings could quickly turn deadly. Elizabeth Carter had developed friendships with several Apache women who occasionally traded goods at the settlement, but even she worried about the safety of her children in such uncertain times. Tommy went about his evening chores without mentioning the girl, helping his father tend to their small herd of cattle and assisting his mother with preparations for the next day's meals. But his mind kept returning to those hollow, hungry eyes, and the way the girl had looked at the bread as if it represented salvation itself. The Carter family's homestead sat on a slight rise overlooking the valley floor, positioned to take advantage of a natural spring that provided reliable water year-round. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James had chosen the location carefully, considering both the practical needs of farming and the strategic advantages of elevated ground. The house itself was modest but well built, constructed of local timber with a stone foundation that would withstand the harsh weather common to the region. From their front porch, the Carters could see for miles across the valley, watching the changing patterns of light and shadow that marked the passage of days and seasons. The view included several other homesteads scattered across the landscape, each representing a family's hopes for prosperity and security in the American frontier. But the valley also contained reminders of its previous inhabitants. Ancient ruins dotted the mesas, evidence of civilizations that had thrived in this harsh landscape long before European settlers arrived. More recently, the Apache had established seasonal camps near reliable water sources, following migration patterns that had sustained them for generations. The intersection of these different ways of life created constant tension in Pine Ridge Valley. Homesteaders like the Carters wanted to establish permanent agriculture and ranching operations, while Apache bands continued their traditional patterns of movement and resource utilization. Both groups had legitimate claims to the land, but the territorial government's policies favored permanent settlement over traditional land use. Tommy was too young to fully understand these complex political and cultural dynamics, but he sensed the undercurrent of anxiety that affected all the adults in his community. Children learned early to stay close to home, to watch for signs of trouble, and to report anything unusual to their parents immediately. Despite these precautions, Tommy found himself thinking constantly about the hungry girl and wondering if she would return. Part of him hoped she would stay away for her own safety, but another part wanted to help her in whatever way possible. The bread had been such a small gesture, but her reaction suggested it had meant everything to someone facing genuine starvation. 3 days passed without any sign of the girl, and Tommy began to think she had moved on with whatever band she belonged to. Apache groups rarely stayed in one location for extended periods, especially when their presence might create conflicts with settlers. But on the 4th morning, as he carried water from the well to the house, Tommy spotted movement near the same oak tree. This time, the girl wasn't alone. A slightly older boy, perhaps 10 or 11, crouched beside her in the shadows. Both children looked even thinner than before, their clothing more tattered, their faces gaunt with hunger. Tommy realized he was looking at siblings who had somehow become separated from their tribal group and were now surviving on their own in the harsh desert landscape. The sight filled Tommy with a mixture of compassion and fear. 2 Apache children hiding near his family's homestead represented a much more serious situation than a single hungry girl. If his parents discovered them, they would almost certainly contact the territorial authorities, who would either try to locate the children's tribe or place them in one of the government schools designed to assimilate Apache youth into white society. But Tommy also recognized that these children were in immediate danger from starvation and exposure. Whatever had separated them from their people, they clearly needed help that only human kindness could provide. The older boy watched Tommy with the wary intensity of someone forced to grow up too quickly, while the girl's eyes held a glimmer of recognition and hope. Without hesitation, Tommy returned to the house and gathered what food he could carry without attracting his mother's attention. A few pieces of cornbread, some dried meat from their stores, and a jug of fresh water represented a significant portion of his own day's provisions. But he couldn't ignore the children's obvious desperation. The exchange happened quickly and silently, with Tommy leaving the food near the oak tree and retreating to allow the children to collect it safely. But as he walked back toward the house, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Fresh hoofprints in the soft earth near the tree, too many to count, leading away toward the higher ground that surrounded the valley. Tommy had grown up on the frontier and knew how to read sign almost as well as any adult. The hoofprints told a clear story. The two children weren't alone after all. Somewhere nearby, probably watching from concealment in the rocks and brush, were other Apache who knew exactly where the children were and what Tommy had been doing to help them. The realization sent a chill down Tommy's spine, but it also filled him with a strange sense of purpose. If Apache adults were allowing their children to accept food from a settler boy, it suggested a level of desperation that went beyond simple hunger. Something had happened to separate these people from their usual resources, forcing them to take risks they would normally avoid. That night, Tommy lay awake in the small bedroom he shared with his sister Emma, listening to the normal sounds of the frontier evening. Coyotes called from the distant hills while closer to the house. Their cattle shifted restlessly in the makeshift corral his father had constructed. But underneath these familiar sounds, Tommy thought he detected something else. The faint whisper of movement in the brush, the almost imperceptible sounds of people moving carefully through the darkness. The next morning brought news that confirmed Tommy's growing fears. His father returned from the weekly trip to the settlement with reports of increased Apache activity throughout the valley. Several homesteads had reported missing livestock, and the territorial authorities were advising all settlers to maintain extra vigilance and to report any Apache sightings immediately. James Carter shared this information with his family over breakfast, his weathered face serious as he outlined the precautions they would need to take. Elizabeth listened with the calm attention of a woman who had already survived numerous frontier challenges, while Emma, only 6 years old, seemed more interested in her porridge than in adult discussions of potential danger. But Tommy felt the weight of guilty knowledge as his father spoke. While other families worried about Apache raids and missing livestock, he had been secretly providing food to Apache children hiding practically in their backyard. The moral complexity of the situation was almost overwhelming for an 8-year-old mind to process. On one hand, Tommy knew he was violating every rule his parents had established for family safety. His secret interactions with the Apache children put not just himself at risk, but potentially his entire family. If the territorial authorities discovered what he'd been doing, they might question his family's loyalty or competence as frontier settlers. On the other hand, Tommy couldn't ignore the basic human need he'd witnessed in those children's faces. They were hungry, alone, and vulnerable in ways that transcended cultural or racial differences. His mother had taught him that Christian charity demanded helping those in need, regardless of their background or circumstances. The internal conflict kept Tommy distracted throughout the day as he helped with chores and tried to maintain normal routines. But his resolve crystallized when he spotted the children again that afternoon, huddled near the oak tree in obvious distress. The girl was clearly ill, probably from exposure and malnutrition, while the boys struggled to care for her with resources that were obviously inadequate. Tommy made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply leaving food and retreating, he approached the children directly, using hand gestures and simple words to communicate his desire to help. The boy initially tensed for flight, but the girl's condition apparently convinced him that they needed assistance more than they needed to maintain secrecy. What followed was Tommy's first real conversation with Apache children, conducted through a mixture of basic English, simple Apache words the boy had learned from traders, and universal gestures of compassion and concern. Tommy learned that the children's names were Running Fox and Singing Bird, that they had become separated from their band during a territorial patrol encounter several weeks earlier, and that they had been surviving on their own ever since. The story emerged in fragments over the course of an hour, but Tommy gradually understood that Running Fox and Singing Bird belonged to a larger group that had been attempting to reach relatives in Mexico when they encountered territorial soldiers near the valley's southern entrance. In the confusion and fear that followed, The children had become separated from their family and had been hiding in the valley ever since, afraid to venture into open country where they might be spotted by military patrols. Tommy's 8-year-old mind struggled to comprehend the full implications of what he was hearing, but he understood enough to realize that these children were not dangerous raiders or scouts for hostile war parties. They were simply lost, frightened, and hungry young people who needed help finding their way back to their families. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the Carter homestead. Tommy quickly motioned for the children to hide while he ran toward the house, his heart pounding with fear that their interaction had been discovered. But the visitors turned out to be neighbors from a nearby homestead, coming to share news and discuss the increased Apache activity that had everyone on edge. As Tommy listened to the adults talking on the front porch, he realized that the situation was more serious than he'd understood. The Apache band that Running Fox and Singing Bird belonged to was apparently the same group that territorial authorities were tracking through the valley. Military patrols were being organized to locate and apprehend any Apache found in the area, with orders to relocate them to designated reservation lands hundreds of miles away. The knowledge filled Tommy with urgent desperation. If Running Fox and Singing Bird were discovered by military patrols, they would be separated not just from each other, but from any hope of rejoining their family. The government's relocation policies were designed to break up traditional Apache bands and force individuals into unfamiliar environments where their cultural survival would be impossible. But Tommy also realized that his ability to help the children was severely limited by his age and circumstances. He couldn't hide them indefinitely without his family's knowledge, and he couldn't help them navigate the dangerous journey to Mexico without adult assistance. The problem required resources and knowledge that an 8-year-old frontier boy simply didn't possess. That evening, after the neighbors had departed and his family had settled into their usual routines, Tommy made another decision that would prove fateful. Instead of continuing to hide his interactions with the Apache children, he decided to tell his parents the truth and ask for their help in resolving the situation safely and humanely. The conversation took place after Emma had gone to bed, with Tommy nervously approaching his parents as they sat on the front porch enjoying the cool desert evening. James was cleaning his rifle, a nightly routine that reflected the constant vigilance required for frontier survival, while Elizabeth mended clothing by the light of an oil lamp. Tommy's confession came out in a rush of words and emotions, describing everything from his first encounter with Singing Bird to his growing understanding of the children's desperate situation. He expected anger, disappointment, or immediate demands that he stop his dangerous behavior, but his parents' reaction surprised him with its complexity and thoughtfulness. James Carter set down his rifle and studied his son's face with the serious attention he normally reserved for important adult decisions. Elizabeth stopped her mending and listened with the same focused concern she showed when treating injuries or illnesses that threatened the family's well-being. When Tommy finished his story, his parents exchanged a long look that communicated volumes about their relationship and shared values. Finally, James spoke with the measured tone he used for the most serious family discussions. The situation Tommy described was indeed dangerous, but not in the ways the boy had imagined. The real danger lay not in the Apache children themselves, but in the broader conflict between territorial authorities and Apache bands that were trying to preserve their traditional way of life. 2 lost children represented both a humanitarian crisis and a potential catalyst for larger conflicts that could affect everyone in Pine Ridge Valley. Elizabeth asked careful questions about the children's condition and circumstances, her nursing instincts focusing on immediate health and safety concerns. James wanted to know more about the signs Tommy had observed, particularly the hoof prints that suggested other Apache were nearby and aware of the situation. As the discussion continued, Tommy realized that his parents were not simply deciding whether to punish him for his unauthorized actions. They were wrestling with the same moral complexity that had driven his decision to help the children in the first place. The intersection of family safety, Christian charity, and broader social justice created dilemmas that defied simple solutions. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all three Carters freeze with sudden fear. From somewhere in the darkness beyond their property, a coyote called with the distinctive rhythm that frontier settlers had learned to recognize as an Apache signal. The call was answered from another direction, then another, creating a pattern of communication that suggested coordinated movement through the valley. James immediately extinguished the oil lamp and motioned for his family to move away from the exposed porch. But before they could retreat to the safety of the house, a new sound emerged from the darkness. The unmistakable rhythm of many horses moving carefully but purposefully toward their homestead, approaching from multiple directions in a coordinated pattern that could only mean one thing. Tommy's act of kindness to a hungry Apache girl had set in motion events that were about to test everything his family believed about courage, compassion, and survival on the American frontier. The darkness seemed to press closer around the Carter homestead as the sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder. James Carter moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had prepared for this moment since the day he first settled in Pine Ridge Valley. He guided his family through the back door of their house, away from the exposed front porch where they had been sitting moments before. Inside, Elizabeth Carter immediately began implementing the emergency procedures they had rehearsed but hoped never to use. She gathered Emma from her bed, wrapping the sleepy 6-year-old in a heavy blanket while whispering reassurances that everything would be fine. Tommy followed his parents through the familiar rooms of their home, but everything felt different. Now charged with tension and the weight of approaching danger. James retrieved his second rifle from its hiding place behind the kitchen pantry, checking to ensure both weapons were fully loaded. The metallic sounds of preparation seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house, each click and scrape magnified by the family's heightened awareness. Through the windows, they could see nothing but darkness, but the sound of horses had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that felt even more threatening. Tommy's mind raced with guilt and fear as he realized the connection between his secret meetings with Running Fox and Singing Bird and the Apache presence now surrounding their home. His parents had not explicitly blamed him for their current predicament, but he understood that his actions had somehow led to this moment of crisis for his entire family. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, cutting through the desert night like a blade, came a single voice speaking in Apache. The words were incomprehensible to the Carter family, but the tone was clear and authoritative. Someone was addressing them from the darkness, expecting a response. James Carter took a deep breath and moved toward the front door, his rifle held ready, but not aimed in any threatening direction. Elizabeth positioned herself near the back of the house with Emma, prepared to escape through the rear door if the situation deteriorated. Tommy found himself caught between his parents, uncertain whether to stay with his mother and sister or follow his father toward whatever confrontation awaited. The Apache voice spoke again, this time closer to the house. James recognized enough individual words to understand that the speaker was requesting permission to approach, using the formal protocols that governed interactions between different cultural groups on the frontier. This was not the beginning of a raid or attack, but rather an attempt at negotiation or communication. With careful deliberation, James called out his response in English, followed by the few Apache phrases he had learned from trading interactions. Over the years, he announced his family's presence in the house and requested that the Apache delegation identify themselves and state their intentions. The formality of these exchanges reflected the careful balance that both groups maintained. When attempting to avoid violent misunderstandings, a new voice responded from the darkness, this one speaking heavily accented English. The speaker identified himself as Chief Stone Eagle and requested permission to approach the house for a peaceful meeting. He assured the Carter family that no harm was intended and that his presence was related to a matter of mutual concern that required immediate discussion. Tommy felt his heart skip when he heard the chief mention 2 children who had been missing from his band for several weeks. The Apache leader's words confirmed what Tommy had already suspected. Running Fox and Singing Bird belonged to this group, and their disappearance had prompted the extensive search that had brought hundreds of Apache warriors to Pine Ridge Valley. James Carter faced an impossible decision. Refusing to meet with Chief Stone Eagle could be interpreted as hostility and might escalate the situation into violence that could endanger his entire family. But agreeing to the meeting meant acknowledging the Apache presence and potentially becoming involved in broader conflicts between tribal groups and territorial authorities. After a moment of silent consultation with Elizabeth, James made his choice. He announced that he would meet with Chief Stone Eagle on the front porch of his house, with both men remaining unarmed and visible to their respective supporters. The agreement represented a significant act of trust from both sides, acknowledging their shared interest in resolving the situation peacefully. The front door of the Carter house opened slowly, and James stepped onto the porch with his hands clearly visible and empty. From the darkness emerged a figure that commanded immediate respect. Chief Stone Eagle was a man in his 50s, tall and lean with the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership and responsibility. His clothing reflected traditional Apache design enhanced with trade goods that spoke of his status and the prosperity of his band. The 2 men stood facing each other across the wooden planks of the porch, separated by cultural differences that ran deeper than language or appearance. But both were fathers and leaders who understood the weight of decisions that affected the safety and well-being of their people. The conversation that followed would determine whether Tommy's act of kindness led to reconciliation or tragedy. Chief Stone Eagle spoke first, his English careful but clear. He explained that his band had been tracking 2 missing children for many days, following signs that had led them to the vicinity of the Carter homestead. His scouts had observed interactions between a settler boy and the Apache children, and he wanted to understand the nature of these meetings and the current whereabouts of Running Fox and Singing Bird. James Carter listened carefully, recognizing the careful diplomacy in the chief's words. Rather than accusing Tommy of kidnapping or wrongdoing, Stone Eagle was providing an opportunity for explanation and cooperation. The Apache leader's approach suggested that he understood the complexity of the situation and was hoping to resolve it without violence or official involvement from territorial authorities. The conversation continued with James explaining his family's recent discovery of Tommy's interactions with the Apache children. He described his son's motivations as simple Christian charity toward hungry children, emphasizing that no harm had been intended and that Tommy had acted without adult knowledge or approval. The explanation was intended to demonstrate his family's peaceful intentions while acknowledging their role in the situation. Chief Stone Eagle received this information with the patient attention of someone accustomed to evaluating complex political and social dynamics. He asked detailed questions about the children's condition and behavior, seeking to understand how they had survived on their own and whether they had been injured or traumatized during their separation from the band. As the conversation progressed, a fuller picture of recent events began to emerge. Running Fox and Singing Bird had become separated from their family group during a surprise encounter with a territorial patrol 3 weeks earlier. The military unit had been conducting what they called a reconnaissance sweep, but which the Apache experienced as harassment and intimidation designed to force them from their traditional camping areas. During the confusion and panic that followed the soldiers' arrival, several families had scattered in different directions to avoid capture or confrontation. Most had managed to reunite within a few days, but Running Fox and Singing Bird had become lost in terrain that was unfamiliar to them. Their family had been searching desperately ever since, coordinating with other Apache bands throughout the region. The story revealed the broader context that Tommy had been unable to understand. The two children were not simply hungry and lost, they were casualties of the ongoing conflict between Apache peoples and the territorial government's policies of forced relocation and cultural assimilation. Their separation from their family represented exactly the kind of tragedy that federal policies were creating throughout the Southwest. Chief Stone Eagle explained that his band's presence in Pine Ridge Valley was not motivated by any hostile intentions toward the settler families. They were simply following the trail of the missing children, guided by signs that their scouts had been able to read in the landscape. The large number of warriors accompanying the search reflected both the importance of the missing children and the dangerous nature of traveling through territory where military patrols might interpret any Apache presence as threatening. James Carter began to understand the delicate balance that the Apache band was trying to maintain. They needed to recover their missing children, but they also needed to avoid provoking the kind of military response that could endanger their entire community. The presence of hundreds of warriors around his homestead was not preparation for attack, but rather protection for a diplomatic mission that could easily be misinterpreted by territorial authorities. The realization changed James's perspective on the situation entirely. Instead of facing a potential Apache raid, his family had become inadvertent participants in a rescue mission that required careful coordination to avoid tragedy. Tommy's kindness to the hungry children had placed the Carter family at the center of events much larger than anyone had anticipated. As if summoned by the conversation, running fox and singing bird emerged from the shadows near the oak tree where Tommy had first encountered them. The boy supported his sister, who was clearly weak from hunger and exposure, but both children moved with obvious relief toward the Apache adults, who represented safety and family. The reunion was subdued but emotional, with several warriors dismounting to embrace the children and assess their condition. Chief Stone Eagle's demeanor visibly relaxed when he saw that both children were alive and apparently unharmed. He spoke to them briefly in Apache, receiving what appeared to be a detailed account of their experiences over the past weeks. The conversation included frequent gestures toward Tommy, who watched nervously from behind his father on the porch. When the family reunion concluded, Chief Stone Eagle returned his attention to James Carter with an expression that combined gratitude and continued concern. He explained that while his immediate objective of recovering the children had been accomplished, the larger problem remained unresolved. His band still needed to reach their relatives in Mexico, but the territorial patrols that had caused the original separation were still active throughout the region. The Apache leader's words revealed the extent of the challenges facing his people. Traditional migration routes had been blocked by military checkpoints. Water sources had been claimed by expanding settlements, and the territorial governments policies made it increasingly difficult for Apache bands to maintain their traditional way of life. The search for running fox and singing bird had delayed their journey south, but they could not remain in Pine Ridge Valley indefinitely. James Carter found himself facing a moral and practical dilemma that went far beyond his family's immediate safety. Chief Stone Eagle was essentially asking for his help in resolving a humanitarian crisis that involved not just two children, but an entire community of people trying to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming political and military pressure. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that chilled both men to the bone, the distant bugle call that announced the approach of a territorial patrol. Someone had apparently reported the Apache presence in Pine Ridge Valley, and military units were responding with the speed and determination that characterized their approach to what they considered Indian problems. Chief Stone Eagle immediately began issuing quiet commands to his warriors, preparing for the possibility that their diplomatic mission might suddenly become a military confrontation. The Apache band had hoped to complete their child recovery operation and depart the valley before attracting official attention, but that window of opportunity was rapidly closing. James Carter realized that his family's safety now depended not just on the outcome of his conversation with Chief Stone Eagle, but on the actions of approaching territorial soldiers who might interpret any Apache presence as hostile. The situation had evolved from a simple case of childhood kindness into a complex confrontation between competing claims to justice and survival in the American frontier. The sound of approaching cavalry grew steadily louder, suggesting a substantial military force was converging on the Carter homestead. Both James and Chief Stone Eagle understood that the next few minutes would determine whether Tommy's act of sharing bread with a hungry Apache girl would be remembered as the beginning of peace or the spark that ignited tragic violence. Inside the house, Elizabeth Carter gathered her children closer while listening to the increasingly complex situation developing outside. Tommy struggled with overwhelming guilt as he realized that his simple desire to help hungry children had somehow created a crisis that threatened not just his family, but potentially dozens of Apache people and territorial soldiers. The moral complexity of the situation was almost impossible for an 8-year-old mind to comprehend. But Tommy understood enough to know that choices made in the next few minutes would affect many lives. His parents had taught him that doing the right thing was always correct, but the current situation seemed to involve multiple right things that contradicted each other. Chief Stone Eagle made a decision that reflected both his leadership experience and his assessment of the rapidly changing circumstances. Instead of attempting to withdraw his warriors before the cavalry arrived, he chose to remain and attempt to explain the situation to the military commander. The decision was risky, but it represented the best chance of avoiding the kind of misunderstanding that could lead to unnecessary bloodshed. James Carter supported the chief's decision, recognizing that his own testimony about the benevolent nature of the Apache presence might carry weight with territorial authorities, who knew his family's reputation in the community. As a respected homesteader with no history of Apache sympathies or anti-government sentiment, his account of recent events might be believed by military officers trained to suspect deception in such situations. The two men spent their remaining time before the cavalry's arrival coordinating their approach to the coming confrontation. They agreed to present a unified account of Tommy's interactions with the Apache children, emphasizing the humanitarian nature of the situation and the peaceful resolution that had been achieved. Both understood that the success of their strategy would depend largely on the personality and judgment of whichever military officer commanded the approaching patrol. As the sound of horses grew loud enough to distinguish individual hoofbeats, Chief Stone Eagle made one final request that surprised James with its generosity and wisdom. He asked that Tommy be allowed to participate in the coming discussion, arguing that the boy's testimony about his motivations and experiences might help the military commander understand the true nature of recent events. The request represented a remarkable act of trust from an Apache leader toward a settler family, but it also reflected Chief Stone Eagle's sophisticated understanding of how territorial authorities made decisions about frontier conflicts. Military officers were more likely to believe accounts that came from multiple sources, particularly when those sources included children whose innocence made deception unlikely. James Carter agreed to the request, recognizing both its wisdom and its risks. Involving Tommy in negotiations with territorial authorities could provide valuable testimony, but it could also expose the boy to consequences that might affect his future in the community. The decision required the same kind of calculated risk-taking that had characterized frontier life since the first settlers arrived in Pine Ridge Valley. The cavalry patrol that emerged from the darkness was larger and more heavily armed than either James or Chief Stone Eagle had expected. 24 soldiers approached the homestead in formation, with their commanding officer maintaining the alert but controlled demeanor that marked experienced frontier military units. The size of the force suggested that territorial authorities were taking the reported Apache presence very seriously indeed. Major William Richardson was a career military officer whose experience with Apache conflicts had taught him to approach such situations with a combination of firmness and caution. He had seen too many confrontations escalate into violence through misunderstanding or premature action, but he had also learned that Apache leaders often used diplomatic overtures to disguise hostile intentions. The scene that greeted Major Richardson was unlike anything in his previous experience with Apache encounters. Instead of defensive positions or preparation for battle, he found an Apache chief standing unarmed on the front porch of a settler's house, apparently engaged in peaceful conversation with the homesteader. The unprecedented nature of the situation required careful assessment before any action could be taken. Chief Stone Eagle stepped forward to address the military commander, using the formal protocols that governed interactions between tribal leaders and territorial authorities. He identified himself and his band, explained the search mission that had brought them to Pine Ridge Valley, and requested permission to complete their journey south without interference from military patrols. Major Richardson listened to this presentation with the professional attention he gave to all potentially significant intelligence, but his training and experience made him skeptical of Apache explanations for large warrior gatherings near settler communities. The presence of hundreds of Apache fighters in Pine Ridge Valley represented exactly the kind of security threat that his unit was designed to neutralize. James Carter then stepped forward to provide his account of recent events, describing Tommy's interactions with the Apache children and the peaceful resolution that had been achieved through direct communication with Chief Stone Eagle. His testimony, as a respected member of the settler community, carried weight with Major Richardson, who knew the Carter family's reputation for honesty and reliability. But the Major's primary concern remained the broader implications of the Apache presence for regional security. Even if the immediate situation involved nothing more than child recovery, the gathering of hundreds of warriors near settler communities could inspire similar actions by other Apache bands or encourage territorial officials to implement more aggressive military policies throughout the Southwest. The conversation between the three leaders continued for nearly an hour, with each man attempting to balance immediate humanitarian concerns against broader political and military considerations. Tommy listened from the porch steps, beginning to understand how his simple act of kindness had become entangled in conflicts and policies that affected thousands of people across the territory. Chief Stone Eagle's final proposal surprised both Major Richardson and James Carter with its scope and generosity. Instead of simply requesting safe passage for his band, the Apache leader offered to establish formal communication channels between his people and territorial authorities, providing advance notice of traditional migration routes and seasonal camping areas in exchange for guaranteed safe passage through designated corridors. The proposal represented a potential breakthrough in Apache territorial relations, offering a framework for coexistence that could reduce conflicts throughout the region. But it also required Major Richardson to make decisions that exceeded his immediate authority, potentially affecting territorial policy in ways that would require approval from his superiors in the chain of command. As dawn began to break over Pine Ridge Valley, the three men found themselves negotiating not just the immediate resolution of Tommy's inadvertent involvement in Apache affairs, but the possibility of a broader peace that could transform relationships between settlers and Apache peoples throughout the Southwest. The little boy who had shared his bread with a hungry Apache girl had somehow created an opportunity for understanding that none of the adults had imagined possible. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge Valley as Major Richardson weighed Chief Stone Eagle's unprecedented proposal. The Apache leader's offer to establish formal communication channels represented a dramatic departure from the patterns of conflict and mistrust that had characterized territorial relations for decades. But accepting such an arrangement would require Richardson to make decisions that could affect his entire military career. Tommy watched from the porch steps as the three men continued their discussion, struggling to understand how his simple act of sharing bread had created such complex consequences. The boy's mind raced with questions about the fairness of policies that separated families and the meaning of courage in situations where different kinds of right seemed to oppose each other. Inside the house, Elizabeth Carter maintained her vigil with Emma, listening to the ongoing negotiations while preparing for whatever outcomes might emerge. She had spent years on the frontier, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated whether tense situations would resolve peacefully or explode into violence, and everything about the current conversation suggested that genuine progress was being made. Chief Stone Eagle's proposal included specific details that demonstrated his band's serious commitment to peaceful coexistence. He offered to provide territorial authorities with advance notice of seasonal migrations, including planned routes and camping locations. His people would respect established homestead boundaries and would make formal requests for access to traditional water sources that had been claimed by settlers. In exchange, the Apache leader requested guaranteed safe passage through designated corridors during migration seasons, protection from harassment by military patrols when his band was traveling for legitimate purposes, and formal recognition of his authority to negotiate on behalf of affiliated Apache groups throughout the region. Major Richardson recognized the potential value of such an arrangement, but he also understood the political complexities that would surround any formal agreement with Apache leaders. Territorial officials had built their careers on policies of forced relocation and military intimidation, and they would be reluctant to acknowledge any Apache claims to traditional territories or migration rights. The conversation was complicated by the arrival of additional homesteaders from neighboring properties, drawn by reports of the large Apache presence near the Carter place. The newcomers included families with varying levels of experience with Apache peoples, ranging from those who had developed respectful trading relationships to others who viewed any Indian presence as an immediate threat to their safety and property. John Miller, whose homestead lay 3 miles to the east, arrived with 2 of his sons and enough weapons to suggest he expected immediate combat. Miller's family had lost livestock to what they believed were Apache raids the previous summer, and his attitude toward Chief Stone Eagle's delegation reflected deep suspicion and barely controlled hostility. In contrast, Samuel Henderson, whose trading post served as an informal meeting place for both settlers and Apache groups, approached the gathering with cautious optimism. Henderson had learned enough Apache language to conduct basic commercial transactions, and his experience had taught him that most conflicts arose from misunderstanding rather than genuine hostility. The presence of multiple settler families created new dynamics in the ongoing negotiations. Chief Stone Eagle found himself addressing not just Major Richardson and James Carter, but a broader cross-section of the local community whose support would be essential for any lasting peaceful arrangement. The Apache leader adapted his approach accordingly, emphasizing the benefits that improved relations could provide for all residents of Pine Ridge Valley. Tommy noticed how Chief Stone Eagle's demeanor changed as he addressed the expanded group. The Apache leader's words became more formal and diplomatic, but also more passionate as he described his people's desire to live peacefully alongside their settler neighbors. The chief's sincerity was evident even to those who remained skeptical of his ultimate intentions. The discussion revealed the extent to which misunderstanding and fear had shaped relationships between the two communities. Many of the livestock losses that settlers attributed to Apache raids had actually resulted from natural predation or theft by white desperados who found it convenient to blame Indian peoples for their crimes. Similarly, Apache complaints about settler aggression often stemmed from encounters with territorial soldiers rather than actual homesteaders. Samuel Henderson shared his experiences trading with various Apache bands, describing their sophisticated understanding of regional economics. and their willingness to engage in mutually beneficial commercial relationships when such opportunities were available. His testimony provided concrete examples of successful cooperation that countered the prevailing narrative of inevitable conflict. But John Miller remained unconvinced, arguing that any accommodation with Apache groups would be interpreted as weakness by other tribal peoples and could encourage increased raiding throughout the territory. His concerns reflected widely held beliefs about the need to maintain clear boundaries between settler and Indian territories, even when such boundaries conflicted with traditional land use patterns. Major Richardson found himself mediating between competing perspectives within the settler community while simultaneously evaluating Chief Stone Eagle's proposals against his understanding of territorial policy and military objectives. The complexity of the situation exceeded anything in his previous experience with frontier diplomacy. As the morning progressed, Chief Stone Eagle made an unexpected gesture that transformed the entire dynamic of the negotiations. He called forward several members of his band, including women and elderly people who had remained at a distance during the initial discussions. The presence of families made it clear that the Apache group was not a war party, but rather a complete community that included non-combatants whose safety depended on peaceful resolution of their current situation. Among those who came forward was an elderly Apache woman named Silver Moon, who had gained respect throughout the region for her knowledge of traditional medicine and her willingness to treat patients regardless of their cultural background. Her presence added moral authority to Chief Stone Eagle's delegation and reminded everyone present of the human costs of continued conflict. Silver Moon addressed the gathering in careful English, describing the impact that territorial policies were having on Apache families and communities. She spoke about children separated from their parents during military sweeps, about traditional food sources that had been destroyed by mining and ranching operations, and about the desperate circumstances that forced her people to take increasing risks in their struggle for survival. Her words provided context for understanding why Running Fox and Singing Bird had been alone and hungry when Tommy first encountered them. The children's separation from their family was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of disruption that was affecting Apache communities throughout the Southwest. Silver Moon's testimony made it clear that the current situation required urgent humanitarian action regardless of broader political considerations. Tommy listened to Silver Moon's words with growing understanding of the injustices that had led to his encounter with the Apache children. The old woman's gentle but firm voice helped him comprehend that his simple act of sharing food had occurred within a context of systematic oppression that made such kindness both more necessary and more dangerous than he had realized. Elizabeth Carter emerged from the house with Emma and approached the gathering, drawn by Silver Moon's voice and the obvious sincerity of her testimony. The meeting between the two women represented a moment of human connection that transcended cultural and linguistic differences, as both mothers recognized their shared concerns for the welfare of children and families in an uncertain world. The conversation between Elizabeth and Silver Moon revealed surprising common ground between Apache and settler women, who faced many similar challenges in frontier environments despite their different cultural backgrounds. Both dealt with limited medical resources, unpredictable food supplies, and constant concern for their children's safety in a landscape where danger could emerge without warning. Silver Moon's knowledge of traditional Apache medicine proved particularly interesting to Elizabeth, who had been struggling to treat a persistent cough that had affected several families in the settlement. The Apache woman's understanding of local plants and their medicinal properties offered potential solutions that European-trained doctors had been unable to provide. This exchange of practical knowledge between the women illustrated the potential benefits of improved Apache settler relations in ways that went beyond abstract political agreements. Both communities possessed skills and resources that could benefit their neighbors, But fear and misunderstanding had prevented such cooperation from developing naturally. Major Richardson observed these interactions with growing appreciation for the complexity of frontier relationships and the potential consequences of military policies that failed to account for local realities. His training had prepared him to think about Apache peoples primarily as security threats, but the evidence before him suggested that alternative approaches might serve territorial interests more effectively. Chief Stone Eagle's next proposal built on the positive dynamics that had emerged from the women's conversation. He suggested establishing formal trading relationships that would allow Apache bands to exchange traditional goods and services for manufactured items and food supplies that were difficult to obtain through other means. Such arrangements could provide economic incentives for peaceful relations while reducing the desperation that sometimes drove Apache groups to take livestock or other property from settler communities. The proposal addressed practical concerns that affected both communities. Settlers could benefit from Apache knowledge of the regional environment, including information about water sources, weather patterns, and the behavior of wildlife that could affect farming and ranching operations. Apache groups could gain access to metal tools, firearms for hunting, and medical supplies that would improve their ability to maintain traditional lifeways in changing circumstances. Samuel Henderson immediately expressed enthusiasm for expanded trading opportunities, having already experienced the benefits of commercial relationships with Apache peoples. His trading post could serve as a neutral meeting place where both communities could interact safely and build the personal relationships that were essential for lasting peace. But John Miller remained skeptical, arguing that any formal recognition of Apache rights to traditional territories would undermine settler claims to land that had been acquired through legal homesteading processes. His concerns reflected deeper anxieties about property rights and legal authority that affected many frontier communities where competing land use systems created ongoing conflicts. Major Richardson recognized that these property rights questions exceeded his authority to resolve, but he also understood that continued conflict over land access was likely to produce more situations like the current confrontation. His report to territorial authorities would need to address both immediate security concerns and longer-term policy questions that required legislative rather than military solutions. As the discussions continued, Tommy found himself observing Running Fox and Singing Bird, who had remained close to their Apache families, but were clearly interested in the ongoing negotiations. The boy realized that these children were not so different from himself, despite the cultural differences that adults found so significant. They faced similar challenges of growing up in a dangerous world where their families' decisions could determine their future, opportunities, and safety. The sight of the Apache children reminded Tommy of his original motivation for sharing his bread: simple, human compassion for hungry and frightened young people who needed help. The complex political and military considerations that had emerged from his act of kindness seemed almost overwhelming compared to the straightforward moral clarity of feeding hungry children. Chief Stone Eagle seemed to sense Tommy's confusion and addressed him directly, speaking in simple English about the importance of kindness between peoples who might seem different, but who shared common needs and hopes. The Apache leader's words acknowledged Tommy's role in creating the opportunity for current negotiations, while emphasizing that lasting peace would require ongoing commitment from many people in both communities. The chief's attention to Tommy surprised many of the adults present, who had not fully appreciated the boy's central role in recent events. But Chief Stone Eagle understood that children often possessed moral clarity that could be obscured by adult concerns about politics and practical considerations. Tommy's willingness to help hungry Apache children represented the kind of instinctive, human decency that could serve as a foundation for broader reconciliation. Major Richardson made a decision that would affect the course of territorial policy for years to come. Instead of treating the current situation as a routine security matter requiring military resolution, He chose to view it as an opportunity for innovative diplomacy that could establish precedents for peaceful coexistence throughout the Southwest. The Major announced his intention to recommend Chief Stone Eagle's proposals to his superiors, with his personal endorsement for a trial period of formal communication and coordination between Apache bands and territorial authorities. His decision represented a significant professional risk, as failure of such an experimental policy could damage his military career and potentially cost lives if violence erupted during the implementation process. But Richardson had been impressed by the evidence of mutual respect and shared interests that had emerged during the morning's discussions. The presence of women and children in Chief Stone Eagle's delegation, the obvious sincerity of Silver Moon's testimony, and the practical benefits of increased cooperation all suggested that alternative approaches to Apache relations deserved serious consideration. Chief Stone Eagle received Major Richardson's decision with dignified gratitude, recognizing both the courage required for the Major to take such a position and the opportunity that formal negotiation could provide for his people. The Apache leader immediately began outlining specific steps that could be taken to implement the proposed communication systems and demonstrate his band's commitment to peaceful relations. The first concrete step would be the establishment of a regular schedule for meetings between Apache representatives and territorial officials, allowing both sides to address concerns and coordinate activities that affected shared territories. Chief Stone Eagle proposed monthly gatherings at Samuel Henderson's trading post, providing a neutral location where both communities could meet safely and conduct business. Additionally, the Apache leader offered to assign members of his band to serve as liaisons with settler communities, providing advance warning of planned migrations and offering assistance during emergencies that might require coordination between the two groups. Such arrangements could help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that had historically led to violence and mistrust. John Miller expressed continued reservations about these proposals, arguing that formal recognition of Apache territorial claims could encourage other tribal groups to make similar demands throughout the region. His concerns reflected broader anxieties about the precedent that peaceful negotiations might establish for territorial policy in other areas where conflicts between settlers and Indian peoples remained unresolved. But the majority of settlers present seemed impressed by Chief Stone Eagle's sincerity and the practical benefits that improved relations could provide. The morning's discussions had revealed opportunities for cooperation that none of them had previously considered, and many were willing to support experimental policies that might reduce the constant tension and fear that characterized frontier life. Elizabeth Carter spoke for many of the settler women when she expressed support for Silver Moon's proposal to share traditional medical knowledge with the community. The potential health benefits of such cooperation seemed especially important given the limited access to professional medical care that characterized most frontier settlements. Tommy watched with amazement as the adults around him worked toward agreements that could transform life in Pine Ridge Valley. His simple decision to share bread with a hungry Apache girl had somehow created opportunities for understanding and cooperation that seemed almost miraculous compared to the fear and suspicion that had previously characterized relationships between the two communities. As the formal negotiations drew toward a conclusion, Chief Stone Eagle made one final gesture that demonstrated his commitment to the peace process. He announced that his band would remain in the vicinity of Pine Ridge Valley for an additional week, allowing time for Major Richardson to communicate with his superiors and for both communities to prepare for the implementation of proposed cooperation agreements. The decision represented a significant act of trust, as the Apache band would remain vulnerable to military action if territorial authorities chose to reject the peaceful initiatives that had emerged from the morning's discussions. But Chief Stone Eagle believed that demonstrating good faith through such gestures was essential for building the lasting relationships that would be necessary for sustainable peace. Major Richardson appreciated the chief's gesture and reciprocated by announcing that his military unit would refrain from any aggressive actions during the week-long negotiation period. He also committed to personally escorting Apache representatives to meetings with territorial officials, providing protection against harassment or misunderstanding that might otherwise complicate the diplomatic process. The agreements reached that morning represented a remarkable transformation of what had begun as a potential military confrontation into an opportunity for innovative diplomacy and mutual understanding. Tommy's act of kindness toward hungry Apache children had created a chain of events that could potentially change the course of territorial policy and establish new precedents for peaceful coexistence between different communities in the American Southwest. The week following the historic negotiations at the Carter homestead transformed Pine Ridge Valley in ways that no one could have anticipated. Word of the peaceful resolution spread quickly throughout the territory, drawing attention from government officials, newspaper reporters, and other Apache bands who had been watching the situation with intense interest. What had begun as Tommy's simple act of sharing bread with hungry children had evolved into a test case for entirely new approaches to frontier relations. Major Richardson faced intense scrutiny from his military superiors, who struggled to understand how a routine Apache pursuit had resulted in formal diplomatic proposals rather than the expected military confrontation. Territorial Governor Marcus Thornfield demanded detailed reports about the negotiations, expressing particular concern about the precedent that peaceful agreements might establish for other regions where conflicts between settlers and tribal peoples remained unresolved. The Major's correspondence with territorial headquarters revealed the complex political calculations that surrounded frontier policy decisions. Military leaders preferred clear directives that allowed for decisive action, but the situation in Pine Ridge Valley required nuanced judgment that took into account humanitarian concerns, local community interests, and broader strategic objectives that often contradicted each other. Richardson's reports emphasized the practical benefits that cooperation with Chief Stone Eagle's band could provide for regional security. Apache scouts familiar with traditional migration routes could assist territorial forces in distinguishing between peaceful travelers and potentially hostile groups. Information about seasonal movements could help military planners anticipate and prevent the kind of misunderstandings that historically led to violence. But the Major also acknowledged the risks associated with formal recognition of Apache territorial claims and the potential for other tribal groups to demand similar accommodations. His recommendations walked a careful line between supporting innovative diplomacy and maintaining the military authority that territorial officials considered essential for frontier security. Chief Stone Eagle spent the negotiation period meeting with leaders from affiliated Apache bands, building consensus for the experimental cooperation agreements that had emerged from the discussions at the Carter homestead. The Apache political structure required extensive consultation before major policy decisions could be implemented, and the chief needed to ensure that his commitments would be supported by the broader community. The consultations revealed significant diversity of opinion within Apache leadership about the wisdom of formal agreements with territorial authorities. Some leaders argued that any cooperation with government officials would be interpreted as surrender and could encourage more aggressive policies toward Apache peoples throughout the Southwest. Others believed that peaceful accommodation represented the only viable strategy for protecting their communities against overwhelming military and economic pressure. Silver Moon played a crucial role in these internal Apache discussions, using her status as a respected elder and healer to advocate for the peace initiatives. Her first-hand observations of settler family life had convinced her that many frontier communities shared Apache values of protecting children and supporting community welfare. despite the cultural differences that seemed to separate the two groups. The elderly woman's influence extended beyond formal political discussions to encompass the daily conversations and informal decision-making processes that shaped Apache community opinion. Her ability to describe positive interactions with settler families provided concrete examples of successful cooperation that countered fears about the risks of increased contact with territorial authorities. Tommy found himself at the center of attention as news of his role in the historic negotiations spread throughout Pine Ridge Valley and beyond. Newspaper reporters arrived from Tucson and Phoenix to interview the boy whose kindness to Apache children had somehow created opportunities for diplomatic breakthrough. The attention was overwhelming for an 8-year-old who had simply wanted to help hungry children. The interviews revealed Tommy's remarkable maturity and moral clarity about the events that had transformed his community. When asked about his motivations for sharing food with Apache children, the boy consistently emphasized the basic human obligation to help people in need, regardless of their cultural background or the political tensions that affected adult relationships. Tommy's words carried particular weight because of his obvious sincerity and the absence of any political agenda in his actions. Adult leaders on both sides of the frontier conflict had learned to be suspicious of each other's motives, but an 8-year-old boy's simple compassion provided a moral foundation that transcended the usual calculations of political advantage and strategic positioning. The boy's newfound celebrity status created unexpected challenges for the Carter family, who struggled to maintain normal routines while accommodating the constant stream of visitors seeking information about the historic negotiations. James and Elizabeth Carter found themselves serving as informal ambassadors for the peace process, explaining the practical benefits of cooperation, while addressing concerns about the safety and wisdom of increased contact between settler and Apache communities. Samuel Henderson's trading post became the unofficial headquarters for implementing the agreements that had emerged from the negotiations. The location provided neutral ground where both communities could meet safely, and Henderson's experience with cross-cultural commerce made him an ideal facilitator for the expanded trading relationships that Chief Stone Eagle had proposed. The first formal trading session exceeded everyone's expectations in terms of both the volume of goods exchanged and the positive atmosphere that characterized the interactions between Apache and settler participants. Apache craftspeople brought beautifully worked leather goods, traditional pottery, and intricate basketry that commanded premium prices from settlers who had previously had limited access to such high-quality merchandise. In exchange, Apache traders acquired metal tools, firearms, ammunition, and manufactured textiles that were difficult to obtain through traditional sources. But more importantly, the trading sessions provided opportunities for personal relationships to develop between individuals from both communities, creating social connections that served as foundations for broader cooperation and understanding. Elizabeth Carter and Silver Moon established a particularly significant partnership focused on sharing medical knowledge and treating patients from both communities. The collaboration combined Silver Moon's extensive understanding of traditional plant-based remedies with Elizabeth's knowledge of European medical techniques, creating a more comprehensive approach to frontier healthcare than either woman could have provided alone. Their joint medical practice became a powerful symbol of the practical benefits that cooperation could provide for both communities. Patients who had previously suffered from limited treatment options now had access to a broader range of therapeutic approaches, and the success of their treatments demonstrated the value of combining different cultural traditions and knowledge systems. The medical partnership also revealed surprising similarities between Apache and European approaches to healthcare, particularly in terms of the emphasis placed on community support and family involvement in treatment processes. Both traditions recognized the importance of addressing psychological and social factors, in addition to physical symptoms, and the collaboration between Elizabeth and Silver Moon strengthened both of their practices. Tommy often visited the trading post during these early implementation sessions, fascinated by the transformation of relationships that had begun with his simple act of sharing bread. He watched Apache and settler children playing together while their parents conducted business, observed adults who had previously viewed each other with suspicion developing genuine friendships, and began to understand the broader implications of the peace process he had inadvertently initiated. The boy's presence at these gatherings served as a living reminder of the human values that had made the cooperation possible. When tensions arose or misunderstandings threatened to disrupt the delicate new relationships, participants often looked to Tommy as a symbol of the innocent goodwill that had created their opportunity for mutual understanding and benefit. Running Fox and Singing Bird became regular visitors to the Carter homestead, with their family's permission and encouragement. The Apache children's friendship with Tommy created additional bonds between the communities while providing all three children with opportunities to learn about different cultural traditions and ways of life. The friendship between the children proved particularly valuable for language learning, as Tommy began acquiring basic Apache vocabulary while Running Fox and Singing Bird improved their English skills. Their communication served as a model for other cross-cultural relationships and demonstrated the ease with which young people could bridge differences that seemed insurmountable to many adults. But the implementation of the peace agreements was not without challenges and setbacks. Some members of both communities remained skeptical of the cooperation initiatives, arguing that cultural differences were too fundamental to allow for lasting peaceful coexistence. Occasional incidents of misunderstanding or conflict required careful intervention to prevent escalation into broader tensions. John Miller and several other settler families maintained their opposition to formal recognition of Apache territorial rights, arguing that such accommodations would eventually lead to demands for compensation or restrictions on homesteading activities. Their concerns reflected deeper anxieties about property rights and legal authority that affected many frontier communities where traditional land use patterns conflicted with new legal frameworks. Similarly, some Apache leaders continued to question whether cooperation with territorial authorities represented a betrayal of their people's independence and cultural integrity. They worried that successful peace agreements in Pine Ridge Valley would be used to justify more aggressive assimilation policies in other regions, ultimately undermining Apache ability to maintain traditional ways of life. These ongoing tensions required constant attention from community leaders who were committed to making the cooperation agreements work despite the challenges they presented. Chief Stone Eagle and Major Richardson worked closely together to address problems as they arose, developing protocols for handling disputes and misunderstandings before they could escalate into serious conflicts. The territorial government's response to the Pine Ridge Valley experiments proved more supportive than many participants had expected. Governor Thornfield, initially skeptical of peaceful accommodation policies, became increasingly interested in their potential as reports of successful cooperation reached his office in Phoenix. The economic benefits of reduced military expenditures and increased commercial activity provided compelling arguments for expanding similar initiatives to other frontier regions. Federal officials in Washington also took notice of the innovative approaches being tested in Arizona Territory. The Department of the Interior, responsible for Indian policy, faced mounting pressure to find alternatives to expensive and often unsuccessful military campaigns against tribal peoples. The Pine Ridge Valley model offered potential solutions that could address humanitarian concerns while reducing costs and improving regional stability. But federal interest in the peace process also created new pressures and expectations that complicated local implementation efforts. Government officials wanted to study and potentially replicate the cooperation agreements, but their involvement threatened to transform voluntary local initiatives into mandatory federal policies that might lack the community support essential for success. Tommy observed these broader political developments with the keen interest of someone who had inadvertently become a central figure in historic events. The boy's understanding of complex policy questions grew rapidly as he listened to adult discussions about the implications of his simple act of kindness toward hungry Apache children. The transformation of Tommy's role from anonymous frontier child to celebrated symbol of intercultural cooperation created unexpected educational opportunities. Prominent visitors to Pine Ridge Valley often requested meetings with the boy, seeking to understand his motivations and learn from his example of moral courage in difficult circumstances. These interactions exposed Tommy to ideas and perspectives that few children in frontier communities ever encountered. He met government officials, military leaders, religious figures, and social reformers who were all interested in the lessons that could be drawn from his experience. The conversations broadened his understanding of the world while reinforcing his basic conviction that helping people in need was always the right choice. Elizabeth and James Carter struggled to balance their son's newfound prominence with their desire to maintain normal family life and protect his childhood from excessive adult expectations. They were proud of Tommy's role in the historic peace process, but they also worried about the pressure that constant attention might place on a young child who was still developing his own identity and values. The family's discussions about these challenges revealed the complexity of frontier life in communities where individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for regional policy and intercultural relations. The Carters had to consider not only their immediate family interests, but also their responsibilities to the broader communities that had been affected by Tommy's actions. As autumn approached, the success of the cooperation agreements became increasingly evident in the daily life of Pine Ridge Valley. Apache and settler families routinely interacted at trading sessions, medical consultations, and social gatherings that had become regular features of community life. Children from both groups played together, adults shared knowledge and resources, and the constant fear and suspicion that had previously characterized frontier relations began to give way to genuine mutual respect and friendship. The economic benefits of cooperation proved particularly significant for both communities. Apache craftspeople found ready markets for their traditional goods, while settlers gained access to knowledge and resources that improved their farming and ranching operations. The increased commercial activity attracted additional business to the region, creating employment opportunities and improving the overall prosperity of Pine Ridge Valley. Major Richardson's periodic reports to territorial headquarters documented the measurable improvements in regional security that resulted from the cooperation agreements. Incidents of conflict between Apache groups and settler communities declined dramatically. Military patrols could focus their attention on genuine security threats rather than routine surveillance of peaceful populations, and the overall climate of fear and tension that had characterized frontier life began to dissipate. The major success in Pine Ridge Valley led to his promotion and assignment to implement similar cooperation initiatives in other frontier regions where conflicts between tribal peoples and territorial authorities continued to create problems for regional development. His experience became a model for military officers throughout the Southwest who were seeking alternatives to purely confrontational approaches to Indian policy. Chief Stone Eagle's leadership of the peace process enhanced his reputation among Apache peoples throughout the region and attracted attention from tribal leaders who were facing similar challenges in their relationships with territorial authorities. Delegations began arriving in Pine Ridge Valley to study the cooperation agreements and consider whether similar arrangements might be feasible in their own communities. The Apache leaders' approach to diplomacy emphasized the importance of maintaining cultural integrity while adapting to changing political and economic circumstances. His success in negotiating beneficial agreements without compromising essential Apache values provided a template that other tribal leaders could modify according to their specific situations and needs. Silver Moon's medical practice continued to grow as word of her successful treatment spread throughout the territory. Patients traveled from distant communities to benefit from her combination of traditional Apache healing knowledge and the modern techniques she had learned through collaboration with Elizabeth Carter. Her work demonstrated the practical value of cross-cultural cooperation while preserving and strengthening traditional Apache cultural practices. The elderly healer's influence extended beyond medical practice to encompass broader questions about the preservation and adaptation of traditional knowledge in changing circumstances. Her ability to maintain Apache cultural integrity while engaging productively with settler communities provided a model for other Apache people who were struggling to balance traditional values with the practical necessities of frontier life. As winter approached, the communities of Pine Ridge Valley prepared for the seasonal challenges that tested all frontier settlements. But for the first time in years, Apache and settler families faced these challenges as allies rather than potential enemies. Shared resources, coordinated planning, and mutual assistance replaced the isolation and fear that had previously characterized winter preparations in frontier regions. Tommy watched these developments with deep satisfaction, understanding that his simple decision to share bread with hungry Apache children had somehow contributed to creating a better world for everyone in Pine Ridge Valley. The boy's actions had demonstrated that individual moral courage could have consequences far beyond what anyone might expect, transforming not just personal relationships, but entire communities and policy frameworks. The winter season would provide the ultimate test of whether the cooperation agreements could survive the harsh conditions and resource scarcity that historically created the greatest tensions between frontier communities. But the foundation of trust and mutual benefit that had been established during the peaceful months suggested that Pine Ridge Valley was ready to meet these challenges through continued collaboration rather than conflict. The story of Tommy's kindness to Apache children had become a symbol of hope for frontier communities throughout the American Southwest, demonstrating that even in the most challenging circumstances, human compassion and moral courage could create opportunities for understanding, cooperation, and mutual prosperity that seemed impossible until someone had the courage to take the first step toward peace. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning when 8-year-old Tommy Carter first shared his bread with a hungry Apache girl named Singing Bird. The transformation of Pine Ridge Valley during those years exceeded even the most optimistic predictions of those who had witnessed the historic negotiations that grew from such a simple act of human kindness. Tommy, now 13 and tall for his age, stood on the platform of the newly constructed railroad depot that served the thriving community of Pine Ridge Station. The town had grown from a scattered collection of homesteads into a prosperous frontier municipality with over 800 residents, representing one of the most successful examples of intercultural cooperation in the American Southwest. The railroad had arrived 2 years earlier, bringing with it economic opportunities that transformed the entire region. But unlike many frontier towns where rapid growth created chaos and conflict, Pine Ridge Station had developed according to carefully planned principles that preserved the cooperative relationships between Apache and settler communities while accommodating the changes that progress inevitably brought. Tommy watched as the morning train pulled into the station, carrying passengers and cargo that connected Pine Ridge Station to markets and opportunities throughout the territory. Among the arrivals were delegates from communities across the Southwest, who had come to study the cooperation model that had made the town famous as a symbol of successful frontier development. The delegation included territorial officials, military leaders, religious figures, and representatives from various tribal peoples who were seeking to replicate the peaceful relationships that characterized life in Pine Ridge Station. Tommy had grown accustomed to such visits, but he still felt amazed when he considered how his simple childhood decision had contributed to creating something that now served as a model for frontier communities throughout the American West. Chief Stone Eagle emerged from the train's first-class compartment, returning from a successful speaking tour that had taken him to Washington, Denver, and San Francisco. The Apache leader had become a nationally recognized advocate for peaceful coexistence between tribal peoples and territorial authorities, sharing the Pine Ridge Station story with audiences who were eager to learn about alternatives to the military. Conflicts that continued to plague other frontier regions. The chief's transformation from regional Apache leader to national spokesman for intercultural cooperation reflected the broader changes that had affected his community during the 5 years since Tommy's act of kindness had created opportunities for peace. Chief Stone Eagle now moved comfortably in both Apache and territorial society, maintaining his cultural identity while engaging effectively with government officials and business leaders who shaped frontier policy. Silver Moon had also arrived. On the morning train, returning from a medical conference in Phoenix where she had presented her research on combining traditional Apache healing practices with modern medical techniques, the elderly healer's work had gained recognition throughout the territory, and her clinic in Pine Ridge Station attracted patients from hundreds of miles away who sought treatment that integrated the best elements of different cultural approaches to healthcare. The medical partnership between Silver Moon and Elizabeth Carter had evolved into a comprehensive healthcare system that served as another model for successful intercultural cooperation. Their joint practice employed both Apache and settler practitioners, offering patients access to treatment options that neither community could have provided independently. The success of their collaboration had inspired similar partnerships in other frontier communities where traditional knowledge and modern techniques could be combined effectively. Tommy greeted Chief Stone Eagle and Silver Moon with the easy familiarity that characterized relationships in Pine Ridge Station, where formal distinctions between Apache and settler residents had largely disappeared in favor of shared community identity. The boys' ability to move naturally between different cultural contexts reflected the success of the integration process that had transformed the entire region. Running Fox and Singing Bird, now young adults, worked as translators and cultural liaisons for the various government and business delegations that regularly visited Pine Ridge Station. Their childhood friendship with Tommy had evolved into professional partnerships that helped visitors understand the practical mechanics of intercultural cooperation while preserving the essential human connections that made such cooperation possible. The Apache siblings had received formal education in both traditional knowledge systems and territorial schools, creating the kind of cultural fluency that was essential for leadership roles in the integrated community. Their success demonstrated the possibility of maintaining strong cultural identity while participating fully in the broader economic and social opportunities that frontier development provided. The afternoon brought the monthly community meeting that had become the primary mechanism for democratic governance in Pine Ridge Station. The gathering included representatives from all cultural groups and economic interests in the region, making decisions through consensus-building processes that combined Apache traditional practices with territorial legal frameworks. Tommy served as one of the youth representatives on the community council, a position that recognized his historic role in creating the peace process, while acknowledging his continued importance as a symbol of the values that guided community development. His participation in governance reflected the community's commitment to including all age groups and cultural backgrounds in decision-making processes. The current meeting focused on proposals for expanding the railroad connections that linked Pine Ridge Station to markets throughout the Southwest. The economic opportunities represented by improved transportation could bring substantial benefits to the community, but residents wanted to ensure that growth occurred in ways that preserved the cooperative relationships and cultural diversity that made their town unique. Chief Stone Eagle presented the railroad expansion proposals with characteristic attention to both economic benefits and cultural considerations. The improved connections could increase markets for Apache craftspeople, while providing settler farmers and ranchers with better access to distant consumers. But the expansion would also bring increased numbers of newcomers who might not understand or appreciate the intercultural cooperation that had made the community successful. The discussion revealed the sophisticated understanding of development, challenges that residents had acquired through 5 years of managing growth while preserving community values. Participants recognized that economic opportunity and cultural preservation required careful balance, and their debate focused on specific mechanisms for maintaining that balance as the community continued to evolve. Tommy contributed to the discussion by emphasizing the importance of education programs that would help newcomers understand the history and principles that had shaped Pine Ridge Station. His suggestion reflected the community's recognition that successful integration required active effort to transmit values and practices to each new generation and each new group of residents. The education initiatives that had grown from Tommy's suggestion represented another dimension of the community's success in managing intercultural cooperation. The Pine Ridge Station school system offered instruction in both Apache and English languages, taught both traditional and modern subjects, and prepared students for success in either traditional or territorial career paths according to their individual interests and aptitudes. Silver Moon's daughter, Maria, had become the head teacher at the integrated school, combining her traditional Apache education with formal training at the Territorial Normal School in Phoenix. Her leadership of the educational program demonstrated the possibility of preserving cultural knowledge while adapting to changing circumstances and opportunities. The school's success attracted families from throughout the territory who wanted their children to receive education that prepared them for life in an increasingly diverse and interconnected world. The institution had become another symbol of the practical benefits that intercultural cooperation could provide when communities committed themselves to mutual respect and shared prosperity. Elizabeth Carter had expanded her medical practice to include training programs for young people from both Apache and settler families who wanted to pursue careers in healthcare. Her students learned both traditional healing practices and modern medical techniques, creating a new generation of practitioners who could serve diverse communities throughout the frontier region. The medical training program reflected the community's broader commitment to combining the best elements of different cultural traditions while creating new opportunities for young people who might otherwise face limited career options in frontier environments. The success of these graduates in communities throughout the Southwest provided additional evidence of the practical value of intercultural education. James Carter had been elected as the first mayor of Pine Ridge Station when the community achieved formal municipal status 2 years earlier. His leadership during the transition from informal cooperation to formal governance demonstrated the possibility of maintaining democratic principles while accommodating different cultural approaches to community organization and decision-making. The mayor's office had become a symbol of the community's success in creating new forms of frontier governance that included all residents regardless of their cultural background. James Carter's administration established policies that protected both individual rights and community interests while maintaining the cooperative spirit that had made peaceful development possible. Tommy often accompanied his father to regional meetings where other frontier communities sought advice about implementing similar cooperation initiatives. The boy's presence at these gatherings served as a powerful reminder that individual actions could have consequences far beyond what anyone might anticipate, inspiring other young people to consider how their own choices might contribute to positive change in their communities. The success of Pine Ridge Station had attracted attention from federal officials who were seeking alternatives to the expensive and often unsuccessful military campaigns that continued to characterize Indian policy. In other regions, The Department of the Interior had commissioned detailed studies of the cooperation model, hoping to develop guidelines that could be adapted to different cultural and geographic circumstances throughout the American West. But residents of Pine Ridge Station were careful to emphasize that their success resulted from specific local conditions and relationships that might not be easily replicated in other settings. They stressed the importance of genuine commitment to mutual respect and shared prosperity, warning that superficial copying of their institutions, without underlying changes in attitudes and values, would be unlikely to produce similar results. Major Richardson, now Colonel Richardson, and commanding officer of the Territorial Military District, frequently brought visiting officials to Pine Ridge Station to demonstrate the security benefits of peaceful cooperation policies. His career had been built on the success of the experimental diplomacy that had begun with Tommy's kindness to Apache children, and he continued to advocate for similar approaches throughout his expanding area of responsibility. The Colonel's reports to federal authorities consistently emphasized the cost-effectiveness of cooperation policies compared to military enforcement strategies. The resources that had previously been required for maintaining large numbers of troops in hostile territory could be redirected to productive development projects that benefited all residents while strengthening regional security through increased prosperity and stability. Richardson's influence on military policy extended far beyond Pine Ridge Station, as his success in implementing peaceful solutions to frontier conflicts had earned him recognition as one of the most innovative officers in the territorial service. His approaches were being studied and adapted by military leaders throughout the American West who faced similar challenges in their relations with tribal peoples. The economic prosperity of Pine Ridge Station provided concrete evidence of the practical benefits that intercultural cooperation could produce when communities committed themselves to mutual development rather than competitive conflict. The town's businesses served customers from throughout the region. Its agricultural products commanded premium prices in distant markets, and its reputation for quality craftsmanship had created demand for Apache-made goods in cities across the continent. The commercial success had created employment opportunities that attracted residents from diverse backgrounds while maintaining the cultural diversity that had become one of the community's greatest strengths. Apache and settler families worked together in businesses that combined traditional skills with modern techniques, creating products and services that neither group could have provided independently. Samuel Henderson's trading post had evolved into a regional commercial center that facilitated business relationships between communities throughout the Southwest. His success in managing intercultural commerce had inspired similar enterprises in other frontier towns, spreading the Pine Ridge Station model of cooperation through practical business relationships that demonstrated mutual benefits. The trading networks that radiated from Pine Ridge Station carried more than commercial goods. They also transmitted ideas, practices, and relationships that helped other communities develop their own approaches to intercultural cooperation. The economic connections created social and cultural links that strengthened peaceful relationships throughout the region. Tommy's role in the community had evolved from symbolic figure to active leader who helped shape the ongoing development of intercultural cooperation initiatives. His perspective as someone who had grown up within the integrated community provided valuable insights for addressing challenges that arose as Pine Ridge Station continued to attract new residents and expand its economic activities. The young man's speeches at regional conferences often focused on the importance of individual moral courage in creating opportunities for broader social change. His message resonated with audiences throughout the territory who were seeking guidance about how their own actions could contribute to positive transformation in their communities. But Tommy always emphasized that his childhood decision to share bread with hungry Apache children had been motivated by simple human compassion rather than any grand vision of social reform. He argued that the most important changes often began with basic kindness toward people in need, regardless of their cultural background or the political tensions that might complicate adult relationships. The message had particular impact on young audiences who were inspired by the example of someone close to their own age, who had managed to create positive change through moral courage and determination. Tommy's story became a standard element of educational programs throughout the territory, teaching children that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for community development and social progress. As evening approached, Tommy walked through the streets of Pine Ridge Station, observing the daily life of a community that had been transformed by the consequences of his childhood kindness. Apache and settler families lived as neighbors, worked as partners, and faced the future with shared confidence in their ability to overcome challenges through cooperation and mutual support. The town's success had not eliminated all problems or conflicts, but it had created mechanisms for addressing difficulties through dialogue and compromise rather than suspicion and violence. The community's experience demonstrated that cultural differences could be sources of strength rather than division when people committed themselves to understanding and respecting their neighbors. Children played in streets where Apache and English languages blended naturally, where traditional games mixed with modern activities, and where cultural diversity was celebrated as one of the community's greatest assets. The sight filled Tommy with deep satisfaction as he considered how different these children's lives were from the fear and suspicion that had characterized his own early childhood. The young man stopped at the monument that had been erected in the town square to commemorate the historic negotiations that had established the foundation for peaceful cooperation. The simple stone marker bore inscriptions in both Apache and English, telling the story of how kindness to hungry children had created opportunities for understanding and mutual prosperity. But Tommy knew that the real monument to those historic events was not the stone marker, but the living community that continued to demonstrate the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different peoples who shared common hopes for their children's future. The success of Pine Ridge Station proved that individual moral courage could create consequences that transformed entire regions and influenced policy throughout the nation. As he prepared for sleep that night, Tommy reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with his simple decision to share bread with a hungry Apache girl. The consequences of that childhood act had exceeded anything he could have imagined, creating opportunities for thousands of people to build better lives, while demonstrating that cooperation could triumph over conflict when communities committed themselves to mutual respect and shared prosperity. The story of Pine Ridge Station had become a symbol of hope for frontier communities throughout the American West, proving that cultural differences need not create insurmountable barriers to peaceful development and democratic governance. Tommy's act of kindness had helped create a model that other communities could adapt according to their own circumstances and needs. But perhaps most importantly, the success of intercultural cooperation in Pine Ridge Station had demonstrated that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they acted with moral courage and genuine concern for their neighbors' welfare. The transformation of a remote frontier valley into a thriving multicultural community proved that individual acts of kindness could create ripple effects that changed the world in ways that no one could predict but everyone could appreciate. The little boy who had shared his bread with a starving Apache girl had grown into a young man who understood that the most important changes often began with the simplest acts of human compassion. His story continued to inspire people throughout the territory and beyond, reminding them that anyone could make choices that contributed to building a better world for future generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.